For a number of summers, when I was a teenager and in college, I worked at a summer camp, a day camp. We had campers, sometimes 200 to 300 kids who would come so their parents could have them out of their hair. And we did activities at the campus, and then we would take them on field trips. And you got pretty good at counting heads when you were a camp counselor, because you could do roll in the morning. About 3 or 4 times a day we did a roll call. The other times it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Where's 8? Who's? And then you have to pull out the roll and figure out who it is that's missing. You couldn't leave anybody behind. That just won't do. And that's something that's going to happen with Jacob's family here. In chapter 46 of Genesis, Jacob and all of his family is going to Goshen, going down to live in Egypt. And the longest portion of what we'll read tonight is a list of names. Hard to pronounce names. Names that I'll pronounce in ways you've never heard, and half the time I'll be wrong. But everyone's accounted for. Everything's going according to plan. It's an unexpected twist in God's plan that this chosen family is going to leave the promised land, leave now that they've got a whole bunch of people, leave and go down to Egypt. But it's there in Egypt that they will grow even more, and God will prepare them for the next great phase. So your chart shows you that the yellow part of the top, that we are in the 10th and the climactic story in the book of Genesis. We are coming to a rapid close, aren't we? There are some great climaxes yet to come in these stories. We've been studying chapters 42 to 47, which are about Joseph's deliverance of his family in Egypt. And tonight, in chapter 46 to 47, we see the part of the reunion with Joseph. Particularly this evening, we're looking at the migration from Canaan to Goshen. Now, this morning, in the 11 o'clock hour, we were looking at the divine encouragement for this migration in verses 1 through 7. We read in verse 1 that Jacob is halting his way out of the promised land, and he stops at Beersheba to worship. Verse 1 says, "So Israel set out with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac." He's right on the edge of the promised land, and he's a little bit uneasy about going. I shared with you this morning how one of the great revelations that God had given to his father Isaac was, don't go to Egypt in the midst of the drought. And I think Jacob is a little bewildered. It sure seems like they're supposed to go, but he stops to worship, perhaps to pray and seek counsel, and God gives him an assurance of his plan in verses 2 through 4. Verse 2, God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will close your eyes." God assures him this is all according to the plan. The plan is not being abandoned. Jacob is not doing anything wrong. In fact, this is what he wants them to do. The Lord says he's not restricted to the land of Canaan. I'll go with you there. You know, that was a very countercultural idea, because in the ancient world, people's gods were thought to be local. The gods of Egypt were just the gods of Egypt. They didn't really work very well anywhere else. They didn't really work very well anywhere. But God is making it known he's not like that. He's not a local deity. He's the God of all the earth. And so I'll go with you, and I will most surely bring you back out. So after receiving this great encouragement from the Lord, in verses 5 through 7, the family migrates outside the borders of Canaan. In verses 5 through 7, I'll read these 3 verses and make a few comments about them. Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob and their little ones and their wives in the wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They took their livestock and their property, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and came to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons and his grandsons with him, his daughters and his granddaughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. These verses perhaps sound a little bit redundant, but there are some subtleties, some slight differences between them. And did you notice, by the way, that there in verse 5, it switches by speaking about Jacob and then talks about Israel and then talks about Jacob. It switches between his old name and his new name. When he was introduced in verse 1, it was the new name, Israel, God fights, strong name, as opposed to Jacob, that name about him clutching and conniving and trying to get whatever he can. Israel, that name is associated with the promise and God's strength. Jacob is that name associated with his weakness. In his journey out of the land, he is totally dependent on God. He literally has to be carted out of the promised land. Now, the carts had been used to come from Hebron down to Beersheba. We're told that the boys showed up with these Egyptian carts, and that's part of what convinced Jacob that this was all true and not a dream. But they're not mentioned until here, after they've traveled 2 days' worth, because the story wants to focus mostly on the Lord's enabling. It is the Lord's encouragement more than any other human agency that made it possible for them to go. Gordon Wenham, a commentator on Genesis, says the narrative draws attention to Jacob's present pathetic weakness. The Jacob who triumphed over his elder brother Esau, Jacob who defeated the angel at the Jabbok, is now so infirm that his sons have to lift him onto a cart to carry him to Egypt. So the promises we see will be fulfilled not through human effort, but by God's overruling. That's well said. It's interesting that in these verses the focus shifts to his boys as taking the lead. They coordinate this migration, put their father in the cart. The language that describes them packing all this stuff and moving along echoes the instructions they were given back in chapter 45, verse 19. Look back at maybe on the same page or the page before. Pharaoh said, "Now you are ordered, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come." Just what Pharaoh had said they do, except they bring their stuff too. I don't know if they distrust Pharaoh or maybe they just don't want to be a burden. One of the things that will happen as they come to Egypt and start talking to Pharaoh is they're trying to make it clear they're not there to be a burden. They're working people, and they're not the sort of people who are going to work to overthrow the society. So perhaps bringing all their things is a testament to that. In verse 5, it was the boys who were taking the lead, and now in verse 7, it's Jacob again who's taking the lead. We're told that Jacob brought them down to Egypt. Well, which was it? It was both, of course. Verse 5 describes the way things practically worked out. His boys took the lead. But verse 7 describes it in the way the social order is. He was the patriarch, and they were really following his lead. All this stuff, a huge migration. It is interesting that of all the family members mentioned, the sons, grandsons, granddaughters, and some daughters as well, Jacob's wives are not mentioned. We know that Rachel had died some years before in childbirth when she gave birth to Benjamin, 20 plus years before. It appears that Leah, Zilpah, and Bilhah are also dead. But what an offspring they have produced. The descendants, the Hebrew word is the seed. The word used in all those promises God gave to Abraham and Isaac and to Jacob, that your seed shall be many. It prepares the reader for what we're going to see in the next couple verses. Next many verses, really, from verses 8 to 26, is a genealogy. All the family is going. I've commented before that of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that Jacob is spiritually speaking the weakest of the three, particularly earlier in his life. And yet, he's the one whose family stays intact when it's all done and said. How about Abraham's? Did his family stay intact? Well, Isaac receives the blessing, but not Ishmael. He's cut off. How about Isaac? Does his family stay intact? Jacob receives the blessing, but Esau, he's cut off. But not with Jacob's family. Oh, they've come to the brink of death and killing each other, but God's kept them. And all 12 of them are going to go on and produce large families that will turn into a nation. All his boys and their families are together under God's grace. Well, we're going to take a look now at verses 8 to 27. I won't say very much as we read through these verses, but a long genealogy is given. All of the children and grandchildren are going to be listed according to the wives of Jacob. So it'll start off with the first wife of Jacob and the son she had and the children that they had, and then it'll go that way. It'll give the first and second generations of each of these children. Part of the purpose of this is to show us that there actually already was a fledgling nation. There I will make you a great nation, said the Lord in the previous verses. There's already a good start with this rather large family. So the introduction to this genealogy is given to us in verse 8, where it says, "Now these are the names of the sons of Israel, Jacob and his sons, who went to Egypt." And now we begin with Reuben, Jacob's firstborn. The sons of Reuben, Hanok and Palu and Hezron and Carmi. The sons of Simeon, Jemuel and Jamin and Ohad and Yakin and Zohar and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Judah, and Onan and Shelah and Perez and Zerah. But and Onan died in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Perez were Hezron and Hamul. The sons of Issachar, Tola and Puvah and Yob and Shimron. The sons of Zebulun, Sered and Elon and Jahlil. These are the sons of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob in Padan Aram with his daughter Dinah. All his sons and his daughters numbered 33. So there's the first and second generations that came through his first wife, Leah. And now we're going to see the first and second generations that come through Zilpah, who was Leah's maid, who became Jacob's concubine, verses 16 to 18. The sons of Gad, Ziphion and Hagi, Shuni and Ezbon, Eri and Arodi and Arali. The sons of Asher, Imnah and Ishva and Ishvi and Beriah and their sister Sarah. And the sons of Beriah, Heber and Malchiel. These are the sons of Zilpah, whom Laban gave to his daughter Leah, and she bore to Jacob these 16 persons. Now we come to Rachel and the children and grandchildren she gives in verses 19 to 22. The sons of Jacob's wife Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. Now to Joseph in the land of Egypt were born Manasseh and Ephraim, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. The sons of Benjamin, Bela and Becher and Ashbel, Gorah and Naaman, Ahi and Rosh, Mupim and Bupim and Ard. These are the sons of Rachel, who were born to Jacob. There were 14 persons in all. The sons of Dan, Hushim. The sons of Naphtali, Yaziel and Guni and Yezer and Shalem. These are the sons of Bilhah, whom Laban gave to his daughter Rachel, and she bore these to Jacob. These were 7 persons in all. And now we come to the totaling of these persons in verses 26 to 27. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt. Did I skip a verse? Did I skip verse 25? No, I didn't? Okay, sorry. Verse 26. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came to Egypt, his direct descendants, not including the wives of Jacob's sons, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2. All of the persons of the house of Jacob who came to Egypt were 70. 70. Now, there's a few interesting things about this. Back to verse 21. Benjamin, the last born, the youngest of them all, wasn't a kid anymore. By the time they leave for Egypt, he has 10 children. 10. Could he possibly have had that many kids when he was so young? And actually, it is possible. So, if, let's say when Benjamin was born, that Joseph, his closest brother, was 6 or 7, That means that when Joseph is imprisoned in Egypt, he's about 10. And so at this point, he would be 32 years old. It's possible. It's possible. He's been rather fruitful. All the persons, we're told in verse 27, were 70. Now, if you exclude the wives, who were not counted at all, and I suppose that's because they've died. Now, to get the 70, what you have to do is you add in some of the daughters, and you add in the Joseph and his 2 boys who are already in Egypt, and then you subtract the 2 boys, the grandsons who've died, and Onan, and you include Jacob himself, and there's 70. And I think the reason it's totaled up this way is that it's kind of like a sacred number. It's 7 on steroids. 7 times 10. And it's a way of saying the Lord has his hand on all of this. Everything is there, and everybody is here. We're all going. Everything's going according to plan. This isn't a census, but it's almost like the first census of the nation. Starting off small, isn't it? But God's going to do something great. Now we come to verses 28 to 34, and they make their way over into Egypt. Joseph is going to receive his family. Judah takes the lead of the caravan in verse 28. Now he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. And now Joseph is going to have this wonderfully tearful reunion with his father in verses 29 to 30. Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he had appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive." His father shows up in a cart. Joseph shows up in a chariot. And what a meeting they have. And as far as Jacob is concerned, he's ready to go. He's had that sweet reunion. But there's still going to be a lot more life. You know, he's going to live there in Goshen for 17 more years. And Joseph is going to take care of him and everyone else. Now, part of this reunion, Joseph starts to give them some guidance about how to talk to Pharaoh. And basically, he's going to tell them in verses 31 to 34 that they need to have a coordinated kind of communication when talking with Pharaoh. They want to get settled into Goshen. Now, Pharaoh had already said he would do this, but you know how it goes with politics and the passage of time. Things change. So to make sure they get into this ideal place for them, here's Joseph's plan. Let's read verses 31 to 34. Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, 'My brothers and my father's household who were in the land of Canaan have come to me, and the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have.' When Pharaoh calls you and says, 'What is your occupation?' you shall say, 'Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that we may live in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians.'" Now that last part is not what they're supposed to say to Pharaoh. That last part is what he's explaining to them. Now, we want to talk in such a way that we can stay in Goshen. Now, the Egyptians, it's not that Egyptians despised anybody at all who was a shepherd and had livestock. They had shepherds and sheep and livestock, but they were especially wary of foreigners who did that. They referred to anyone from Canaan as the Asiatics. Lumped them all together. It was very stereotypical, very demeaning. Most of the people who lived in the realm of Canaan were in agribusiness. And so the idea of these foreigners migrating over here and bringing all their stuff and eating our grass and drinking our Nile water and threatening our agro-business, well, they didn't look too very kindly on that. And so there was a bit of social ostracism. They wanted to keep their distance from them. There was already, we read earlier in the stories, that Egyptians did not eat with foreigners. And that was part of the same cultural bias. You throw in this agribusiness part, and it's even worse. So the instructions are, okay, tell him what we're doing, that we've been doing this for generations. I've done this, my father did this, my grandfather did this. This is what we do. This is all we do. We are not coming in to take over. It's not our job to tell you Egyptians how to run your land. We are, in fact, later on in the next chapter, he'll say that we are sojourners. We are temporary residents. We've come here for a time. We are hardworking, but we're not ambitious. We are no threat to Egyptian society. So that's the instructions. And now we come to a little bit of chapter 47 we'll press into tonight. The family has an audience before Pharaoh. It starts with discussions with Pharaoh over this settlement in Goshen in verses 1 through 6. Joseph makes an initial approach in verse 1. Then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, "My father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen." And he's seeding the idea that this is a good place for them to be. They've already brought all this stuff. I know you told them not to bring all this stuff, but they brought all this stuff, and it's in the best place it could be. So he's seeding the idea that let them be as they are. Pharaoh now interviews 5 of the brothers. Verse 2, he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" So they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please, let your servants live in the land of Goshen." 5 men are picked. We're not sure which ones. I would guess Joseph, knowing these Neanderthals, picked the 5 who could speak the best and present themselves the best and are less likely to stick their foot in their mouths and embarrass the whole family. 5 of them, maybe not picking all of them because it looks like a small army if you bring that many in. "We've come to work. This is what we do. This is what our fathers have done. And we're just here to sojourn," they say in verse 4, temporary residents. No intention of upsetting the Egyptian cart system, if you will. So Pharaoh now in verses 5 to 6 gives them permission. Verse 5, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know of any capable men among them, then let them put in charge of my livestock." Wow. Not only can they stay where they've migrated to and do their business, if any of them are particularly good, hire them to work for my extensive herds and my livestock. What amazing favor this is that God's given. Who would have expected all of this? Of course, when the brothers came down to Egypt couple years before to buy grain, they were just hoping to get a deal and stay alive. They had no idea what God had been doing with their brother Joseph and his sovereign appointments. And now here they are receiving grace upon grace. It's an amazing testament to the sovereignty of God to bring about events you could never, ever imagine. There's one more audience that Pharaoh has in verses 7 through 10, and that's with Jacob. Jacob, the aged man. Verse 7, Joseph introduces his father to Pharaoh. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And that might simply mean that it's probably more than he gave him a kind greeting, but perhaps prayed for him or pronounced a blessing on him in a way that's not presumptuous. Pharaoh then interviews Jacob, who speaks in very humble tones. This is not a time to puff yourself up and play the big man. Verse 8, Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many years have you lived?" So Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. What an interesting way to respond. He is also striking this same note. I've lived a hard life. I know how to work hard, and I've seen a lot of difficulty, and I just want to lay low. That's the idea. It is striking the word that Jacob uses to describe his life. Look again with me back in verse 9. Verse 9. So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning. Now he's talking about his whole life. He talks about his life as a sojourn. Now that was literally true of Jacob. He was born in the promised land, and he had spent his whole life in tents. They built a few structures here and there, but they really weren't permanent dwellings. He was a man who moved from place to place as the Lord had instructed. The Lord had told Abraham, and by extension Isaac and Jacob, not to settle in those Canaanite cities. Stay out in the country. Stay separate and distinct. And he came to see his whole life as a kind of sojourning. You know, the same is true of us. We have homes and permanent addresses and mailboxes and all that, and that's fine. But spiritually speaking, we need to see ourselves as people who are passing through. This world is not our home. We're going on to what God has promised, and that requires a different mentality. So for 200 years, God has been telling this family, stay separate. Stay separate from the Canaanites. And to differing degrees, they've done it or haven't done it. And now they're going to go down to Egypt, and God is arranging it so they can stay separate, that they can be in Goshen on the eastern edge of the land. Close, by the way, to where Joseph lives. Joseph lives in the city of On, where his wife came from. It's right next to Goshen. And there he'll keep an eye on them. And more importantly, there God will keep his hand upon them and prepare them for what's yet to come. A few things we'll look at last. Verses 11 and 12. Joseph gives assistance to the settling of his family. Israel's settlement is made in choice land by royal decree in verse 11. Verse 11, so Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, and the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. The land of Ramses is another name for the land of Goshen. Ramses was, there are a couple people named Ramses. The most famous one, Ramses II, hadn't been born yet. A lot of the gods of Egypt movies and things, they try to make the Pharaoh of the Exodus to be Ramses, but that doesn't work. He wasn't around yet. Seems like there was a previous Ramses, and there was a city of Ramses on the edge of Goshen, and all of this land went by that name as well. It's choice land. It's rather fertile. I shared with you, I believe it was last week, that the name Goshen means something like fertile land. Fed off of the Nile and all its tributaries. It's a great place to be. And not only does he settle them there, but Joseph will personally attend to supply his family's needs. Verse 12 tells us, Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food, according to their little ones. He took careful note, how much he wasn't just a guess. He didn't just throw money at them. He was taking personal inventory of how much each of these households would need. In addition to what they could earn through their livelihood, they were going to need some other assistance. And Joseph was there. Joseph was caring for them. God was caring for them in a very, very unexpected way. In God's providence, he can do things so unexpectedly. Things that we would never think of. Who would think of, let's send the whole promised family down into Egypt? Who would think of that? God did it and showed his hand, showed his sovereign power in bringing about things that they could never imagine. Well, when we come back to chapter 47 and go into chapter 48 next week, we'll see how Joseph is trusted in administration, and he helps the Pharaoh to grow in his power, at the same time helping the people, and at the same time, in a unique way, helping his family to survive what they could never do on their own. How good God has been to preserve his promise. And then coming after this, the last major sections of the book, I don't know if you can read it horizontally here, but the end of chapter 47 through chapter 49 is a very unique section where Jacob, before he dies, gathers together all of his sons and their grandsons, and he pronounces blessings on them, prophetic blessings blessings which will cast a shadow over the rest of the Bible. And we'll spend some time looking at some of those key promises as God has been faithful to keep the promise alive. Well, let's have prayer together. Our God, we thank you that you are one who keeps the promise alive. We thank you that you have kept us by your word, by the good hope of the gospel, that you are with us, that you are working through us. We thank you, Father, for the answers to prayer that you give to us, the unexpected things you do, the things that are sometimes beyond our comprehension, beyond what we could ask or think. You do these things. Sometimes the answers to prayer are long in coming, but you are faithful. And you are faithful to fulfill every good word you've made to us through Jesus. So just as Jacob and his family learned to sojourn and learned to wait, so teach us and help us to keep before our eyes the great promises that have been secured for us by the blood of our Savior. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen.